So, Lone Rider here, and I wanted to do a follow-up on the Cold Steel Hutton practice saber for HEMA. This is something that I've been meaning to do for a while, and I've just been kind of a little lax. I actually had a chance to use this against another sword a week or so ago. We were just mucking around. We weren't really like full-out sparring or anything, but it was fun. The guard didn't get dinged up badly. It does have this rolled edge, or somewhat reinforced edge. So it was light, but it didn't get dinged up badly. It seemed to have held together pretty good. The blade has some scuffs in the back and some scuffs in the front. There's a few nicks, but they're really tiny. Considering how thin the leading edge is, it held up fine. And then I put a tip on it only because the front tip, I would argue it's probably not all that safe for thrusting. Just because it's not rolled or anything. It's a narrow, really thin tip, and it's actually rounded. And I've actually stabbed through, packaging material with it. So I wouldn't want to try and thrust a person, even if they're wearing protective gear and whatnot. But how did it hold up so far? Well, it held up so far pretty good. I've also been swinging it around a lot and using the lapel in the garage. But having used it against another sword was nice because it gives you a perspective you don't get from just swinging it around or just hitting a lapel. So the one thing I noticed is that I was using it against a medieval sword, which was larger and had more mass, and it was also much more expensive. It was like a Regnier or like a steel or something like that. But anyway, out of this sword's typology in class. But I'll just use this piece of metal bar to demonstrate. When the blades were locked, if it was dead on, it was fine. There was a little bit of give because this is a sword that has less mass, but not much. However, if it was just slightly off center, the sword would flex, as you can see here. And basically anything past this point, anything past the fort of the blade up, the sword would flex. So here it would flex, here it would flex, here it would flex. And this is edge on, just slightly off angle edge on. Slightly off of, direct like 90 degrees. Now, from the side, any sword will flex if you press on the flat because, it's weaker that way. From this direction, it usually isn't a problem, even for blades that don't have much mass in them. I mean, these sabers are really light, and sabers generally are a light sword compared to other types of sword. Rapiers are a lot heavier than sabers, and even in these practice versions, that's the case. This rapier is a lot heavier than this saber. But both of the blades have very little mass in them. This one happens to be longer, the rapier, but both of them have very little mass in them, and they're both very flexible blades, as you can see. However, if I press with this rapier against this sword, you'll see, like a saber, you'll see the saber bends a little there. The rapier doesn't bend at all. The rapier will bend if you press on the flat, of course, but not if you press this way. So this isn't bending at all, and this has a very flexible blade, and it doesn't have much mass in the blade. You see how thin it is. This blade isn't quite as wide, but it's actually thicker, and in fact, it has a thick spine on the back. So I don't know why when it's just slightly off center, it actually flexes. Maybe it's just the steel, quality of the steel. Maybe it's, I'm parring too far up. Obviously, the guy was using a bigger sword, so I wasn't having the chance to parry with this part of the blade, like down here where you're supposed to. That might have just been user error on my part. But one of the things I did notice is that if it was just slightly off of a dead-on 90 degrees, which it almost never is, by the way, it would just make it flex, even when it's edge on, and I thought that was weird. Now, I can think of two things. Again, it's a cheap sword, so that may be part of it. It may be the blade is so narrow and flimsy by comparison. Or it could be that because it's curved, remember this is the only curved sword I've ever used, because it's curved, it's actually pushing up at an angle, not like this, and that may be accentuating the twist that's applied to the blade. So it may not just be flexing the blade from a straight force. It may actually be like twisting, the force may be being applied to the blade in such a way to actually twist it rather than just bend it. I don't know. But what I was pleased with was after the sword, the blade is very flexible. It bends. It returns to true, and it's still straight. So that's pretty good. I was told that not to really use this for sparring, though, because the edge is so narrow The people at the local fencing club don't like it. They're afraid it might split a finger or something. I mean, I get that. You know, there's that. It's actually kind of funny because I'm really happy to have a saber. I really would like to get a nicer one. I heard that you can get blades from other manufacturers that will fit this hilt, which is nice. You can get a much nicer blade on a usable hilt, and you know, that saves you some money right there, especially if you already have the hilt like I do. You know, it's just, I did do some modifications to it. This is just to show you. So I have this leather washer over the blade like they did on some historical ones. That's just to cover where it meets the guard. But if you look at that, you'll see there's like a slit in there now where the shoulders of the blade actually sit into this reinforced thick part of the guard, which I think is actually intended as a counterweight. You can even see what's brazed on, the yellow there, that's brass. But yeah, there's this thick piece on top of the guard where the blade goes in. But the blade originally just rested up against there. The shoulders rested up against there, and then the tang went in. Because it just rested up against there, it didn't fit into a notch or anything. The hilt never got loose. It never rattled. It never jangled. It never did anything like that. But there was a tendency for the blade to shift slightly. And because this reinforced section is pointed on either end, and they align with the front and back of the blade, when it was like having a visual guide. When it was off slightly, I could really notice it because of those points. So it annoyed the bejeebus out of me. So what I did is I just took a tool and I just cut a groove in there so that the shoulders of the blade could fit slightly recessed into there. That keeps this from turning. I mean, I guess it could still turn, but the whole thing would have to crank over. And then I just put my little washer on there. I didn't really do any other mods to this except for the tip. And, you know, that's what I have so far. What I did think about was actually bluing the guard. You know, so that's stuff used to treat like tools or gunmetal to make it dark so that it doesn't corrode, so that it's more protected from corrosion anyway. It was a combination of the fact that where this gets scuffed up, it tends to get little pit marks, and also it just tends to get pit marks. I think the steel is of a different steel than that's used. I mean, this Hanwei sword is in the same price range. They're both budget swords. This doesn't have a single rust spot on it, and I've had it even longer than this. And I haven't taken any different care of this. So I think, I'm not a metallurgist, but this is more prone to rusting, I think. And I've actually heard that from other people as well. But that said, so I thought maybe about bluing the hilt or something along those lines. But yeah, right now I'm actually saving up for a proper fetter instead of my old blunt longsword. So this is going to have to be on the back burner. But it is something that I want to take a look at in the future. I'm going to take a look at maybe some of those aftermarket blades. Because, you know, like a saber from Castile Army or something would be really nice, but they're really fracking expensive. If I can just get the blade and fit it myself and maybe make my own wood grip or something, I'll take that, right? Because what I really want is the blade. And honestly, one of the criticisms I did have of this sword, after my initial first impressions video, which was like, ooh, I have a saber, how awesome. Looking back, I think I did try and point out some of the problems with the Hanwei Hutton and the fact that this was similar in terms of its sort of flimsy construction, but the blade lacks so much in breadth compared to an actual military saber. I mean, I have handled what's called picket weight swords, which are basically like dress swords. I actually handled one from the American Civil War, and it's about this wide. In fact, it's actually a little wider than this. So, you know, it's not the most robust thing, and I get why they don't want me hitting people with it. They're afraid it might split a thumb or something. I get that. The edge is very narrow. In fact, if you wanted to try, you could probably sharpen this and use it as a sharp instead. I don't know if that would do you any good because it's obviously not really optimized for cutting. It doesn't have the breadth of the blade. Obviously, if you did that, you could never use it for practice again because that would just be totally wrong and dangerous. But, you know, I have had blades where they didn't work out as cutting blades, and I blunted them and made a practice sword out of it. And I've also had practice blades where I've you know, tried to sharpen them. It's just, you know, you're mucking around, you're experimenting. It's just, you have to remember, okay, once the blade is sharpened, you can't use it for practice, and vice versa. Usually, it's not practical. Usually, the geometry, for example, as far as the edge goes, you know, a blade that's designed to be blunt for practice is usually has such a big edge. There's just too much material to try and remove to make it sharp you'd end up ruining the blade, or it would just take too long to be practical. But you know, on the other hand, for some of them, I mean, this is so thin, you probably could try and sharpen this if you wanted. Um, but I think the point that the guy at the fencing club was making is that he thought it was too thin, really, to be safe to hit people hard with, which I get. I mean, he said use it for drills if you want, but don't use it for sparring. Okay, fair enough. Honestly, as far as sparring in terms of not just doing a drill with another fencer, but actually just fighting, sparring, I've only ever done that once in my life, and I wasn't very good. So, you know, I'm a noob at this. Yeah, I'm not going to just start wailing on somebody with a sword. Certainly, if the instructor tells me that it's not, you know, the blade's not safe for that, I'm definitely gonna consider this. But if you're considering the Cold Steel Hutton, keep in mind it may be. To me, it was a good introductory to saber. I'm glad I got this. And yes, it's light in the blade, and it really twisted when I was in the bind. But you know, if I gave deflecting cuts, it worked fine, even against a bigger, broader sword. So, I mean, think of what a proper saber blade would do, right? It would be really effective. This was a nice introductory to saber. It was a nice budget saber. It was just to get, you know, started, and certainly as a backup. I mean, like, yeah, nothing wrong with having this. Glad I got it. But it does have some shortcomings, and one of the shortcomings, which I wasn't aware of, is that some people are going to look at the really thin edge and not just say, "Oh, that's going to get scuffed up a lot." They might look at that and say that edge is too thin. It might hit too hard because you have too much force, you know, concentrated on a narrow area. It's almost like hitting with a, you know, just an unsharpened real sword, and you don't want to do that. Now, I don't know. I saw this edge is very thin, but I never saw it as dangerous. But then again, I'm not a fencing instructor. One of the instructors tells you the edge is too thin. You know, you kind of got to take him at his word. You know, so consider that if you're considering getting one of these as an introduction to what it's like to handle a saber. If all you've ever had are straight blades, it's kind of cool. But on the other hand, you know, you can't really, at least in my experience so far, a lot of people probably aren't going to be comfortable sparring with you with it. Certainly you're going to have to tip it with something because the tip is too pointy. And, you know, yes, it's a good introductory to saber, but, you know, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, we need more mid-range and budget HEMA stuff that works. Like, it's no point buying a saber if the fencing club isn't going to let you use it, right? That's just not cool. So, like, I wish they had said something, you know, only suitable for solo drills or whatever, or, you know, only suitable for light sparring. Okay, at least they could say, well, they told me so. But then again, you know, each HEMA club probably makes their own determination, and what's good for the goose might not be good for the gander, so I don't know about that. I just did want to do a little follow-up on this, and I did want to point out that that is an observation I had. I liked how it handled against another sword. I like the fact that I did get a chance to use it against another sword, not just hitting a pellet in the garage. And I like the fact that, you know, it's introduced me to saber, and it's a fun thing to have and muck around with. Again, I would also like to have a nicer saber with a broader blade that, you know, maybe I'd be allowed to spar with, but we'll see what happens as far as that goes. There's a lot of other stuff to take care of, too. So, but yeah, just my follow-up on the Cold Steel Hutton, and that's that. Lone Rider out.